Hello geographers, welcome to your CAT help session for this week. You've got 2 4-mark questions and a 6-mark question on your CAT. You should be becoming quite familiar with these sorts of questions now, but let's just have a little look at them. The first question, outline the process of photosynthesis within the carbon cycle. Remember that within this sort of question about outline, we want to be basically briefly describing that process. So we want to give some context about how that process works, factors that could affect it, maybe the stages that might happen within photosynthesis, maybe the chemical equation that might go with that. So we want to keep nice and focused just on that process, and we want to, as it's a 4-mark question, make sure that we're saying 4 things about that process. Almost an identical question here, but for a different process. So question 2, explain, is pretty much the same as outline. Explain the concept of, or outline the process of. Very, very similar bits of terminology here. Explain the concept of carbon sequestration. Now it's important that we understand what we mean by that term, and you should go back and have a look in your notes and see if you can find some examples of what comes under that idea of carbon sequestration. It's worth remembering that carbon sequestration can either happen naturally or the result of human activity. So you might want to address both of those within your answer. Again, as it's a 4-mark question, we want to say 4 things, 4 nice, clear, distinct points. The third question is a 6-mark question, and it says figure 1 shows the change in greenhouse gas or GHG emissions grouped by the relative wealth of country between 1970 and 2010. So we can see that we have quite a bit of data in this graph, and the question is asking us to analyse the data, and only the data that is shown in figure 1. Okay, we want to make sure that we're perhaps going back to our little acronym that we use in these sorts of 6-mark questions. We want to look for the trends. We want to support those trends with evidence from the graph, and we must make sure that we are manipulating that data. And the A stands for anomalies. So we want to look for anything that doesn't quite fit the pattern. There are several things that we need to think about within this question. So firstly, we might think about the total emissions and how they vary from low-income countries, lower middle income countries, upper middle income countries, and high income countries. We might think about how the totals vary between those different groups of country. So when we think about their relative wealth. If we also look at the fact we've got data for 1970, 1990 and 2010, and we've got that for all of the countries, we can start to maybe think about changes over time. We can think about how high income countries have changed between 1970 and 2010. We could think about how upper middle income countries have changed, how lower middle income countries have changed, how low income countries have changed. Remember that when you're taking these numbers, don't just steal the numbers from the graph. So don't just tell me, for example, that lower middle income countries have increased from 3.4 to 7.9. I'm not interested in that. I can see that for myself. What I want to know is how much of an increase is that? How many times bigger is one number than another? So we can look at the different wealth brackets. We can look at the totals and how they've changed over time. But we can also consider the relative proportions of these different categories. So the green bit represents agriculture and forestry, the yellow bit represents industry, the grey bit represents commercial and residential buildings, transport and energy production, and so on. So we can start to think about, okay, well in a particular country, roughly what percentage is represented by a particular category. So here, for example, we can approximate, okay, that if the total for 2010 in high income countries is 18.7 and energy production is not quite coming up to 10, is it? There's 5, so I reckon that's probably about 8 or so gigatons of carbon. And I can think about how does 8 compare to 18 or almost 19. So we can say that that is approximately 50%. Obviously you can get a calculator and work that out more accurately, but just as a rough indication, that's a calculation that we could be doing. Now you don't need to worry about trying to look at every group of country in every year and for every category, because that will take you ages. You don't need to worry about that. Just look for the general trends and patterns, back those trends and patterns up with evidence, and see if you can spot the anomalies. There are a couple of anomalies in there of things that don't fit the pattern that might be shown by other countries, so see if you can spot what they are. Make sure also that you are manipulating the data. You don't need to explain in this question. It's worth pointing that out as well. You don't need to tell me why high income countries have increased, or why upper middle income countries have increased more quickly than lower middle income countries, or why low income countries emit most of their emissions through agriculture and forestry. You don't need to explain, you just need to analyse, which is all about describing in detail. That's what you need to do. Good luck.